See.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin. With here, my comrade at arms, Mike Sauter. How's it going, Mike?
Good, Michael. I don't know how it feels there in Michigander, but there's something about this time of year. Even those people who aren't working in the academic calendar, I just feel like energy is being demanded of me that I don't feel. It's the dog days of summer, and I've got some allergies, and so every year this time rolls around, I feel like I should be summing up more energy than I have, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's a little lethargic. Lethargy's moving in. Yeah, here, I live on a farm, so at this time of year I start watching the barn swallows.
Yeah, beautiful.
My barn is full of them. And sometimes I'll go out there in the morning and over the pasture, there'll be, I bet 75, maybe 100 birds. And but at this time of the year, I start watching to see when they disappear. Because when they leave indicates how early winter will arrive.
Do they migrate? You're saying? So I'm not familiar.
Oh, they do. And
where are they going to go?
2 years ago, 2020, they left at the Feast of the Assumption. So they were the 15th of August, they were gone already, which is strange. Usually they don't leave till the beginning of September. And that year, we had a hard frost the third week, not even the third week in September, which was never happened in my entire life. So I pay attention to that these days. And I thought they left the other day, but they did not. So they're still here. So anyway.
Will you write that briefly? Will you write that in a journal of some kind, or you just have a pretty good memory?
Oh, and I have a good memory. I don't have to.
Yeah.
But so last year they didn't leave till about the 6th or 7th of September. And we had a relatively mild winter last year.
Do you scrape off their muddy nests at that point?
Never.
Okay.
I leave them to come back next year.
I worked for many years at a Trappist monastery. I'm still very connected.
A lot of people try to get rid of them. I don't.
Yeah, in the spring I had to. We had I was again a guest house at a Trappist monastery here in upstate New York, the Abbey of the Genesee. But there were so many nests being built in the spring that I would go out with a broom handle. It's not a fun job, but before the eggs were laid, it seems the day after a nest was built, they're laying the eggs. Yep. So because they would swoop at people, often from New York City, a big part of our
people from New York City too.
Anyway. Yeah. And so well, good. This all ties into our guest, I think.
I think in some way it will. So today our guest is a scholar I have admired for a very long time, and Ronald Hutton, author of many books, and I'll tell the story of. So I was in graduate school. I was working on my master's degree. And I was doing my thesis on the figure of the ass in Shakespeare, which, so if you know Shakespeare at all, Midsummer Night's Dream, the bottom turns into an ass. And then in Twelfth Night, then no one turns into an ass literally, but Malvolio is made into an ass. And there's a lot of ass jokes in there. Right, go shake your ears is one of the things they say to Malvolio, and it occurred to me that Shakespeare was working with something with the cycle of the year. So it had Christian but kind of pagan folk elements to it as well. And I was speaking to my advisor, who was an historian, so it was kind of cool to do a Shakespeare thesis with a historian as my advisor, and he was a medievalist and early modernist like Ronald is, and he said, well, you've got to check into Ronald Hutton, and this is about 1998. And so right at that time, so I bought Ronald's The Rise and Fall of Merry England, which has rarely left my side since in my scholarly work, because Mike, as you know, so much of what I've written about has been that kind of, that metaxu between what we could call folk religion or paganism and Christianity, and especially, my doctorate is in early modern English literature, and I discovered through that process that my tutelary spirit is Robert Herrick. so and Robert Herrick's poetry, it's all mixed up too. I mean, is it Christian? Is it pagan? Is it folk religion? Is it Roman pagan? It's all mixed up. And basically, when people ask me what my religious tradition is now, I say, well, basically, we're Catholic neo-pagans. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ronald Hutton to the podcast because of that. And Ronald, besides The Rise and Fall of Merry England, he's the author of many, many books. I just have a few written down: The Witch, The Triumph of the Moon, Stations of the Sun, which I bought around the same time I bought The Rise and Fall of Merry England. And most recently, which this brought, I didn't even know about this one, Ronald's most recent book is Queens of the Wild, which a friend of mine who was actually writes also for A Jesus Imagination, Jonathan Geltner, sent me the link to it a couple of weeks ago. Say, did you know about this book? Because if you look through the table of contents, I mean, he's got chapters on Mother Earth, the Fairy Queen, Lady of the Night, and so forth, the Green Man, and which, as far as listeners of this podcast and followers of my own work will know, those are all buzzwords for sophiology, as far as I'm concerned. So, Ronald, welcome to the show, and I'd like to ask you to start with. I kind of told you my path into this kind of material. What was your path into your research material?
It's simply that I had all these enthusiasms when I was an adolescent and never let them go. I discovered, to my wonder and amazement and gratitude, that once I was appointed to Bristol University, having left Oxford, they assured me that I could teach whenever I liked for the rest of my life, whereas I'd been used to a sister in the older universities, whereby you had to teach the syllabus, whatever your private enthusiasms were. And so I took them at their word, perhaps rather more generously than they'd expected, and ended up writing on all these different things since.
I love it.
I formed the idea that middle age should really be a revenge lifestyle in which you get to do all the stuff you really want to do between the ages of 13 and 16.
That's wonderful.
I like that. There's a lot of quotable stuff in that one sentence, isn't there?
Yeah, I had so also I look back, and I was not quite a teenager. I was maybe in my 20s. What I discovered through T.S. Eliot's poem "The Wasteland," his references to his footnotes, I should say, to Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance, and to The Golden Bough, which I said I better check those books out. So I investigated that, and I was captivated by these ideas that that the celebration of the Christian year, for instance, had much more import and agricultural significance and cosmic significance than I was raised to believe in the kind of sterile Roman Catholicism of my childhood. And it was liberating. And then it became a Waldorf teacher, and it was one of the only places you still see people celebrate Michaelmas and May Day in the United States, anyway. So that was liberating. Now, let me ask you this. So a lot of what you do has been on, we could call it a paganism of the Middle Ages or the early modern period, but also modern iterations of what we call paganism. And so how would you define pagan?
It's a word coined by Christians to indicate the rooted religions, It's literally the religions of the Pagus, the Roman imperial unit of local government. In other words, they're the old religions, the religions that are part of the land and the locality, rather than the newly appeared, brash, pick up and carry evangelical Christian religion. And as an umbrella term for the pre-Christian religions of Europe and the Middle East, it works perfectly well like that.
Yeah, it does. And so how then? What would you attribute we can call the modern interest in a popular interest in paganism? It's kind of like a renaissance of what we call paganism these days. To what would you attribute that?
To the fact that ancient paganism, along with a lot of stuff that really is not suitable for or relevant to the modern age, contains very real elements that certainly are very well suited to the modern age. I think there are three in particular. One is that there are strong feminist elements. There are goddesses as well as gods. There are priestesses as well as priests. Second is its link to the idea of an inherent sanctity in nature, which fits very well into the modern emotional reaction, which is wholly justified towards a fresh organic relationship with the natural world at a time when we're in danger of annihilating it, or at least disturbing it to the point at which large elements of it disappear. And the third inheritance from the pagan ancient world is a disinclination to believe that the divine makes laws or rules for humans, and instead credits humans with the right, the ability to express themselves, realize their own natures, and find maximum self-fulfillment, while doing as little harm to anybody or anything else in the process as possible. And those three things together provide an upswell of energy for modern needs, which is very real.
Yeah, and
go ahead, but
no,
it
go ahead,
strikes me, just as a little parentheses there, Ronald, is that the way you described paganism there too is, if you bring in this kind of wanting to be, left alone and not bothering other people too much, and nature, you have the makings there of a political coalition we need, that in America, you might say the traditional right would say this kind of like, leave me alone, against tyranny and so forth. And the left would maybe be seen as more connected with nature and the natural world. But this, I always get teased because I have a fascination, which grew out of a blogger here in the States, a name you might be familiar with. I've seen your names in tandem, but John Michael Greer, who highlighted the character of Johnny Appleseed in the US as somebody who could really emblematize, and in fact, that maybe somebody, who could really be a pole star, not only for, again, kind of a liberty and kind of a do your own thing, but also, a kind of a new political realignment,
I think that could work in much the same way over here on this side of the Atlantic.
Okay.
I also agree that John Michael Greer is a very fine writer, extremely intelligent person. And something else which Roman imperial style paganism had in common with other ancient paganisms, and would also work quite well for the present world, is most of the time, with some notable exceptions, a generally pluralistic attitude to religion, a belief that anybody was entitled to their own religion, providing it wasn't politically or socially disruptive, and was loyal to the agreed government, as long as it didn't keep the neighbors awake at night and didn't break any laws. And if you want to make it public, you could go along to the Senate in the Western Roman Empire or to an oracle in the Eastern Roman Empire. And if they looked at your proposal and it seemed viable, you could actually have public temples and be eligible for public grants of money and support.
That's interesting, because it could, I'd have to think about that more, because it could, some people are looking at the current iteration of the state in the US, and saying that constitutes a religion in and of itself. I'm sure you're aware of that discourse. But that's one of these creative tensions I think we're facing at this moment in history. And that when people want to come down too quickly on one side, I see it as a bubbling cauldron, to use another pagan image, that during this time things are falling down, born. But it's certainly one of those dynamic tensions that are very, very alive right now. In the Catholic world, Ronald, you have everybody answering that question. I shouldn't say everybody. You have huge swaths of the Catholic world answering some of these tensions with a call for a new theocracy. I'm sure you see that in the British Isles too.
Things are pretty different over here. I've stressed similarities between our nations, but there are also profound differences. One of them being that America is the most religious country in the developed Western world. That is the nation in the developed Western world in which most people attend some kind of religious service regularly. And the United Kingdom, the Czech Republic, are the two nations in that world in which people do so least frequently. We simply have fewer fundamentalists, not just than the USA, but than most countries. We're a much more secular society, and religion is much less part of social and public discourse. And so we're naturally less worried about things, often just less conscious of things than people are in what you might call more normal countries.
Interesting.
So now Ronald, your work came back into it's always been on my radar, and every time I write a book, I turn to yours as resources. But a few years ago, my brother-in-law gave us a set of DVDs of the British television show Tudor Monastery Farm, in which you were like an expert. They would bring you in as the expert on festivals and things like this. And so I was watching with my two youngest sons, and they're now 11 and 13. They were probably 9 and 10 at the time. And I didn't know anything about the series. And then I said, like, it's Ronald Hutton. And they said, you know that guy? Well, I don't know him. I know his work. I said, well, how come you're not famous like he is? They think anybody who's on TV is famous. And I said, I am too famous. But that was, for my kids, and I've seen this book through my whole career, because so much of my own work, skirts that border between Christianity and paganism. And in fact, my 21-year-old son, a couple of years ago, his last year, he saw the movie The Wicker Man in the 60s, I think. It was early 70s.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, well, it's basically using Sir James Fraser making the movie, and there's human sacrifice in it. So it's very Christian pagan, or mostly pagan, from the Middle Ages. And my son saw the film, and I said, "Oh, Dad, I just saw The Wicker Man." I said, "Well, yeah, what do you think?" Because it's basically our house without the human sacrifice. Good point. Which it is. It really, it's kind of.
Remind me not to go digging up around your yard when I visit, right? I'm kind of nervous about what I'll find.
Actually, as you know, Mike, I live on a Native American burial ground.
You do, yeah, right.
So yeah, so there's American pagan all over this place over here. So my question is, what my kids thought was inspiring in that series is that it showed to them. It was very, very similar to the way we live, but it showed to them this way of living the year, living the you could call it the Christian or the agricultural cycle, however you want to say it. And in fact, this year, we live on a small farm. When I finally was able to find a source for geese, so I brought these geese home in March, and the first thing my 13-year-old son says, "Now we can have a Michaelmas goose," which came straight from the series, right?
Yep.
Which was the plan. Now, so I wonder if you could say anything about how these traditions that you have so, I mean, not only beautifully, but in a very solidly scholarly way, what do they have to say to a modern people? And I've seen, and I just got on. I had a phone call yesterday from some young man who had encountered my blog, and he had just read one or two of my books, and he was on fire. He said, "How can people do this stuff?" And so, Ronald, I would like to know what you think that this research has to offer to the modern world.
This might be the central question. Yeah.
As with the case of a lot of historical themes, ideas, images, the traditional festivals of Europe need redeploying in a different context, because pretty well wholesale, they were tied to the farming year, to the production of food. And this suited a society in which, even in a relatively urbanized nation like England, until about 1850, the vast majority of people lived in the countryside and were directly or indirectly involved in farming and its products. And as late as 1810, that was still over 80% of the population. But by 1910, over 80% of the English population lived in cities and were employed in occupations related to industry, commerce, or services. And that's the way it stayed. And this is more and more the pattern across the world. So what's needed to be done is to redeploy festivals that are really suited to a lost world across most of the West to one in which the year has been redesigned around humanity. So our widely observed festivals now are Christmas, which may well be still a way of keeping cheerful in a gloomy time of year, but it's also very family-centered. And then comes New Year, which is often a way in which those who've put up with the family and the children through Christmas get a chance to socialize with friends and let rip in a more adult way. And then there's Valentine's Day for lovers. There's Mother's Day at different dates and different sides of the Atlantic for mothers. There's Easter for the family again. And then we take off into the summer vacation period, in which we turn the traditional way of celebrating a holiday, which is to stay in the community and get the community together to have fun, inside out, so that you leave the community to go somewhere sunnier and stranger and more exotic in the vacation period. And then you come back together again, the community, towards the end of the agricultural time and celebrate Halloween and Guy Fawkes Night in Britain. And then you rev up towards Christmas and the festive season par excellence. So the humanity in its life cycle has replaced the natural world in its life cycle at the center of our seasons. But we can still take on trappings, ideas, rituals, games from the old agricultural cycle to enliven our human-centered cycle. And also, these rituals can do something much bigger, which is more and more needed in the modern developed world, which is to reconnect with two things from which we're largely cut off by urbanization and industrialization. And one is the natural world, and the other is a sense of organic community, a rooted sense of community. And festivities create community, and they reconnect, they link humans together with each other and with the environment. And those are both precious commodities in an increasingly mobile, unstable, and atomized world. I'm not preaching against the modern world. It gives us freedoms which exactly suit an old-fashioned small L liberal like me. But there's a price that we've paid, and we're trying to undo some of that damage.
Yeah, and
Fascinating.
And this is a story I've told before on the podcast, but it's true. So at our farm, we celebrate a lot of festivals, and we as public festivals, we have May Day and Michaelmas, sort of starting off and ending our agricultural cycle on our farm. And what happened is 2 years ago, when COVID hit and everything was shut down, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, it ended, 2 years to flatten the curve or whatever it was. And so very few people showed up to our May Day festival that year. And Michaelmas was also, well, it was kind of rainy, so it was sparsely attended. But in 2021, when we did May Day, and people were still under many, COVID restrictions here in Michigan. And so I told a couple of people, we're going to have this festival. You gotta come. I think I only told 2 or 3 families in the neighborhood. And so they came, but a friend of my wife said, can I tell a couple of my friends? She said, sure. 50 people showed up at our festival with children, with, families, to celebrate May Day. It happened to be a glorious day. And they all, spoke to me as, how meaningful it was for them to connect with other people on a farm, in nature, and doing something that had both convivial but also a sacred dimensions to them. And I remember at the time thinking, just being kind of stunned, even though I already kind of intuitively knew it, but really having this confirmation of how important these kinds of festivals are, and how, and I think modern people are starved for it and don't know it. So that's part of the reason that I'm so interested in your work, but also that I think what you offer by you're not staying locked in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. You let yourself range into the modern world as well in your scholarship, and I think that's important because it makes the world whole in a way, or at least
a little interjection. On some of that is, Ronald, most of my career has been working with, say, young adults in what's called campus ministry. And I've got 4 children myself. Mike has a heck of a lot more than that. But, there's, at least in the US, there's a mental health crisis of unimaginable proportions coming out of COVID with that demographic. And so much of it, we were leading into this before COVID and the lockdowns and things. We were leading into, still anxiety was ranking so high prior to that. But you get a sense that when you talk to an average young person, and I'm guessing it's the same in the UK, is that, they look at their day and maybe even their week according to one term and one term only. Was it a productive day? Angela, how are you doing? Well, I had a productive day or an unproductive day. It's a new insight, but it's directly connected to this ubiquitous sense of anxiety the younger generations feels. So you have the whole notion of time, right? And in church world, we often contrast kairos, God's time in the Greek, with chronos, God's time. Chronos, clock time with kairos or kairos, God's time, the time it might take to heal a broken heart, the time it takes to grieve the loss of a loved one, and these more natural rhythms. And I think, we have maybe 2 ways out of that anxiety producing chronos. And I often refer to this as like killing time, kind of turning that phrase around. How do you kill chronos? Well, one way is, and it's not all bad, this name Eckhart Tolle, there's great insights there, is to go into the now, to create an awareness of the present moment. So we all know, whether we're good at that or not, it has great potential. It has great restorative properties. But the other one too is to humanize clock time, right? And to give it these cycles that you so eloquently described, Ronald. When you mentioned Mother's Day and Valentine's Day, though, again, here for young people, Valentine's Day, as of late, is seemingly, with a loneliness crisis, bringing more pain than joy. And I think that's a true statement for young people. And Mother's Day, of course, the founder of Mother's Day here in the States, renounced it even before she died, because it had already become so crazily commercialized, But it's kind of, I offer those insights, and turn it back to Ronald, because I think this is the hub of the conversation. If we can get some of this down, I was very appreciative of what you said about these festivals surrounding humanity. We do need that. Well, let's call that progress. You could have this kind of Tolkienite nostalgia, which is different from memory, to go back to only the agricultural one. And I can kind of lean towards nostalgia myself in some sense. But what you're saying is so valuable. Say more. What does some of this make you think?
I can't say I ever feel nostalgic about the past myself, largely because I have to live with it daily. People quite understandably remark on the way in which historians tend always to view the past through the lens of the present. And that's absolutely correct. But there's a less noticed, equally powerful countervailing current, which is that we spend so much time in the past that we tend instinctually to see whole bits of the present through its lens in trivial ways, like when I was studying the spread of early modern Western colonial empires like the Portuguese in search of spices. I began putting nutmeg and cayenne into my food each evening. But one of my working partners at the moment is Oliver Cromwell, the general and statesman who ran Britain in the 1650s. And walking to work every morning, I generally find Cromwell in pace with me. And I find myself explaining sights to him and trying to explain how the modern world works. He has most trouble with joggers. And the second thing is the sheer number of different churches which delights him, and then the realization that most of them are now deconsecrated and turned to other purposes, which upsets him deeply. So we live half in the past in my kind of job as well. It's too much alive for us for nostalgia really to be a sentiment. In many ways, trying to shake it off is a way to a healthy world.
Yeah, I feel the same way, since I spend so much time in 17th century English poetry. My companions along this path are Henry Vaughan and Robert Herrick. I have one to be serious with and one to drink beer with. That's the truth.
Yeah.
So now it's interesting. Now this is totally personal. So when I was a young Waldorf teacher, so 30 years ago probably, I couldn't make enough money to live on a Waldorf salary. So I also had a job as a gardener and landscape designer, and so I worked a lot of wealthy people's gardens. And one of my clients was it was a family of neo-pagans, and I didn't know it when I took the job, but I was a good flower gardener, and they had a gorgeous garden, and I brought it to life. And I remember her telling me, "Michael, you're more pagan than anybody I know," and which I took as a great compliment. And
Sure.
Right around that same time, so a couple years later, maybe that same year, my wife and I were invited to it was called a summer greeting ritual, which it was in Ann Arbor, so it was a lot of Ann Arbor, University of Michigan types. And the story was that there was this community from England who had escaped to Canada. They were kind of a pagan community that had maintained their traditions going back to before the early modern period. And that, so they brought this ritual to Canada and they wanted to spread it around to other people. And so the story was they gave it to, somehow I got to this guy I knew, and they invited us. And so my wife and I went. She was pregnant and she was only 5 months pregnant, but she looked like she was 11 months pregnant. She was so huge. And so we were invited to this thing, and I was given the role of the fool, or whatever he was called. And there was a lord and the lady. And so there was kind of a ritual that I don't recall too much of. There was festivity. And then it ended with a game of hide and seek, where all the men had to try to catch the lady, and the women had to try to catch the lord. Well, my wife could barely run, so she just sat down, and of course the lord walked right up to her practically, and she grabbed him, and I caught the lady. And the idea was that whoever catches the lord and lady will be next year's lord and lady. Of course, I had a falling out with those people, and we weren't invited back. So as far as I'm concerned,
Mike had a falling out with people? Surprise,
Oh,
surprise.
Yes. I know you are. Yeah, so I thought we were Lord and Lady Emeritus. Now, so we're Lord and Lady for life, right? But my question is, does that sound plausible to you? I mean, that was actually something that was smuggled out of England?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence to weigh up, so I can't provide anything like a professional answer. Right. What you're describing, Lord, Lady, Love Chase, Fool, sounds very late Victorian Edwardian, which is actually what most modern paganism seems like and sounds like. It's not a pejorative comment on my part. It's one reason why it's so well suited to the modern world. It takes ancient ideas and filters them through modern needs, including those of the birth of modernity in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sound at all pre-modern. Yeah. But without seeing any evidence, I can't pronounce definitively on it, and I don't reject anything out of hand if I haven't seen the evidence for or against.
That's at the time I probably believed it, but over the years when I started to think about it, I said, I bet somebody just made this up. But I don't know either, right? There's no way to tell.
Well, I've made your journey in that when I was a boy, which was the 1950s, 1960s, the prevailing scholarly orthodoxy really was that huge amounts of pagan belief, pagan loyalties, pagan ideas and images had survived far into the Christian period, and in many ways made popular culture in particular through the medieval, early modern periods still essentially pagan with this veneer of Christianity over the top. And I believe that along with everybody else. I believe that the people persecuted as witches in early modern Europe were practitioners of a surviving pagan religion. And then along came the 60s and 70s with a wholesale reevaluation of received 19th, early 20th century wisdom, creating a range of modern liberal and questioning movements and subcultures. And these ideas were examined and found to rest on faulty evidence. I think in many ways my own relationship with this process is that coming in towards the end of the debunking, demolishing, revisionist wave, I have been trying to see what we can rebuild out of the ruins. The real picture of the past we can find, but also an explanation for why people really wanted to believe this stuff between about 1880 and 1980, and what purpose it plays in our lives.
Let me ask a question that it might be hard to formulate, and I think I might be doing a disservice to you, Ronald, and to any listeners, but it's a sense of, to say for maybe the last 6 months, I've been taking a deep dive into William Blake is to say I've spent 1 minute doing it. It seems to me, that I've been reading a lot about him, and I still feel that the more I know, the less I know. But, from what I've gathered, you have a sense, that I want to say that, there's one sense of looking at paganism that could see, that if nature has a feminine kind of identity in some sense, that some of paganism is almost like a going back to the womb, right? That Freud might talk about this oceanic oneness, and that, William Blake, his use of the word vision, and put in conversation with like St. Paul talking about the restoration through man of nature, that, even Blake, in the hands of a great literary critic, Northrop Frye, Northrop Frye will kind of extrapolate that Blake was very different, from the Romantics, what Wordsworth was trying to do, so to draw with too big of a brushstroke, we have two versions of the world where, a man comes out of the womb or a human comes out of the womb. And I can see it with young people, whether it's through intoxication or certain forms of sexuality, we're trying to recreate this oceanic oneness. And paganism has some truck with that type of sensibility we have. Whether we've achieved it or not, there's a claim made for kind of the Christian dispensation that we can return to that oneness with no loss of individuality. In fact, the opposite, that we find that the more Ronald Hutton becomes that unique Ronald Hutton. And I'm remembering when I say this, Ronald, your first statement, how that, all of a sudden you could use middle age as like to pursue who you were and this move to Bristol. And I was laughing and just took such joy when you said that. But could you comment on that a little bit, like how where paganism might be susceptible to those critiques, or maybe I'm out to lunch, or maybe there's two strands within paganism. But at a time like this, an anxious time, people do want to do all these activities, drugs, pornography, that sink them, or the crowd formations we see in politics. A community, in my sense, is, a universe is apart from a crowd. The restoration of oneness at the higher level, where Mike Martin and all his, shining individuality, it becomes so comfortable with others, that we have that yearning too. Can you comment on this, and the role paganism and neo-paganism might play in this? Or if you're very familiar, you're so brilliant with William Blake, what you see in his contributions.
I think he is brilliant. I think he's important. I also think he's very unusual. He's out on a limb. If you're going to put him in a category, it's that of a particular type of 17th, 18th, early 19th century visionary Christian. Mm-hmm. And indeed, he's part of a community of those, self-consciously, that feeds into the radicalism, the political radicalism of the 1790s, 1800s. With the broader question of the role of paganism in all this, like most kinds of religion, paganism is extraordinarily malleable in its actual social and political implications. After all, Christianity can indeed plausibly be used to underpin most political systems, from theocratic and monarchical despotism to revolutionary republicanism. And if you walk into a Roman Catholic church and a Quaker meeting house, you can hardly believe that you're encountering the same category of religion. So paganism also is susceptible to these remodelings. If you take an aspect of paganism like its sacralization of sex, its treatment of human sexuality as something that is a divine gift, good and positive and sacred, that can actually take a person in diametrically opposed positions or in diametrically opposed directions. If you sacralize sex, it can be taken as something so important. You have to be really careful about with whom you do it, and under consecrated conditions like a commitment for life. Or alternatively to others, the sacralization of sex could be an incentive to enjoy it with as many partners as possible without any sense of restriction. And I've seen both effects in people who've equally correctly used the term pagan of themselves. And paganism can lend itself to a thoroughgoing libertarian and liberal political ethos of individual choice and human rights, or it can be linked to a particularly toxic kind of racist embedded nationalism, organically related to race, the land, the tribe. So I think that there's no one implication for any of the undoubted identifiable core features of paganism. Rather like shades of paint, you can spread them on entirely different surfaces to create entirely different effects.
Fascinating. What's your thought on this, Michael?
No, I want to sit with that.
Yeah. I think
it's accurate. I mean, I think it's a good insight, and I think it's valuable to bring that to people's attention.
Yeah, and I wonder, I can add another layer to this and say that, again, a claim made for maybe, what are we going to call it, the Judeo-Christian dispensation, is the unique role of history. We might say, again, if we're going to use the womb, we could look at the Garden of Eden as a womb metaphor. And it seems to me, you read the book of Genesis, and he, of course, wants to go back to the womb as any baby does, but there's a cherub there and, and says, there's no way you're going to have to reach that union again at a higher level, which, in my understanding of, or at least my hope, and let me just say, this is hope. It's not a claim of triumphalism, but at this historical dimension to the Christian piece is that, I hope we're seeing with more clarity that the way Christianity could be used, you're saying, and I think you're right, paganism could go either way. My prayer for the Christian church is that we saw those things and now the one direction is becoming totally clear that it's the right one. And I tend to think a lot of the themes are there articulated by William Blake, that it is about the liberty, the sons and daughters of the children of God. And it is about, of the two forms of oneness, the oceanic oneness, where we reduce Ronaldness to fit into something like a crowd, or we heighten it. So we find the ultimate community symbolized by the Trinity, three blindingly unique persons in a community that makes the womb almost seem alienating. Does this historical dimension that I'm trying to mention, is that, how would you put this into the conversation? And again, I want to make sure I'm not trying to sound triumphalistic.
I think you're making a perfectly good argument. I think that Christianity, like any religion of the book, is saddled with history in a way that other kinds of religion are not. In other words, it's constantly referring to texts which are themselves written in what is now, in each case, the quite remote past. So yes, if you have scriptures, then history is going to be embedded in what you do. But I also think that along with all the other challenges in the old-fashioned sense of the word that modernity or late modernity are facing, is that of adapting inexorably into pluralist societies that are multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-faith. And there is no doubt that some religions have more of a problem with that than others. Now, I'm not suggesting that religions which are based upon supremacist claims of monopoly cannot adapt to pluralism. They do it all the time. They do it in front of my eyes. But there is always a problem of how you deal with your fundamentalists built into that. And you read the Quran, you read the Bible, Hebrew and Christian, And there are quite a few passages in all three of those great books which do seem to establish that there is a single right faith, and the rest are, to put it politely, very problematic. And so there are real problems built into certain kinds of very powerful, very traditional, and very prevalent religion when adapting to a pluralist modern or postmodern society that, ironically, some more primitive kinds of religion, which never got integrated with state systems to the same extent, don't have to reckon. But I say this in many ways to extenuate fundamentalism, in that it's so easy if you're a well-meaning liberal, as I think each one of us is, with an old-fashioned small L meaning of the word, a willingness to recognize validity in other points of view, that fundamentalists are actually following texts which can be read as unequivocally intolerant in the traditional writings of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
And what I heard you say, it's brilliant, is when you were pointing how like sexuality can be done one of two ways, what I heard you just saying is the text, which could be liberating, can also be so highly enslaving.
Yes.
Yeah, so what I've noticed in the students I've had or people I've known over the course of history, or course of my history, who have been inclined toward, say, neo-paganism or esoteric or occult directions, it seems to me that, and I also, I've been teaching college for, 30 years now, 20 years, 25, is that they get attracted to it because they don't, the ones I know, they've become attracted in those directions because they don't feel fed in the tradition in which they were born. They don't feel nourished there. And so they're looking for an experience of the sacred in some way that's meaningful to them. And I think Jordan Peterson, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, a lot of the attraction toward him is that I think he gives young men who have not had an experience of the sacred or a mythic understanding of the world, gives them something to start with. And I see it with my students. I mean, there are a lot of 22-year-old nihilists out there. It's really hard. And what I noticed this last semester, I've talked about before when I taught this course on romanticism. In fact, the name of the course was Love and Romanticism. And how after what they've been through for the last 2 years with being taught in masks and what have you, that they felt, and we weren't wearing masks in that semester, and they felt liberated, and they felt that they could tell me, we're committed to this, we love this class because these poets are saying something to us about that life means something, and one of the women did a paper on romanticism and Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, which is kind of a late romantic. It's a critique of romanticism while being a celebration of it at the same time.
With a beautifully
and it's very
well done
connected
remake.
to the agricultural year, right? But what's interesting to them is that it gave them something to think about that was meaningful. And it wasn't just that, but they said, a couple of them said that what they learned from the last 2 years is that so-called success and politics and all these other things are worthless if you don't have something that's meaningful in your life. And love is meaningful, or for other people, it's, and love is meaningful, but also this connection to creation, which so many of my neo-pagan brothers and sisters have validated, because it brings them back into a relationship with something that's sacred and real. And I think this is, so for me, you know, neo-paganism is a lot to teach Christianity right now, because basically a lot of neo-pagans are just doing old, you know, an earlier form of Christianity without Christianity, right? And I'm encouraged by that. And like we mentioned John Michael Greer earlier, I think he's a great example of this, right? So I think it gives me hope, just like your books give me hope too, Ronald. So where I'm heading here is, so you can tell that what you've written and has been part of what has imparted meaning to my life. My question is what has it done to yours?
It's enabled me to be incredibly self-indulgent, in that I've been able to spend a paid career just reading about and writing about stuff that I've always loved. And also, unlike a lot of my academic colleagues who are superlative writers, but still hate writing, for me, it's a therapy. It's what I do instead of yoga, or basket weaving, or Aikido. Or maybe it's what I do as well as breathing and eating. It's just, it just comes naturally to me. I'm never more happy than I am when preparing to write and writing. It's what I do. It's just the way my genes are hardwired. But I think that those bits of random incidents in the gene pool do also predispose different people to different needs and therefore to different beliefs. It may well be that pagans have something to teach Christians, and that modern pagans have learned a few useful things from Christians and others as well. But different types of people are going to go for one or the other, or for alternative faiths. If you're somebody who is intensely literate, intensely inquiring, aggressively resistant to forms of authority, incredibly expressively individualistic, and quite countercultural, you'll probably be attracted to paganism in its modern forms more than some other kinds of religion. If you're somebody who really enjoys following rules, if you like to work with an established structure of belief and authority, with a strong emphasis on community, or you're somebody who feels totally trashed by life and really need to rebuild yourself by submitting yourself to a higher power, then paganism is probably the worst possible thing for you. Something like traditional Christianity would be far more amenable and far more positive. And if you're somebody whose idea of heaven on earth is to have a comfortable, spacious house in a suburb with a nice garden where you have a reliable marital partner to whom you're devoted, and children who have the same interests as you, beliefs in you, and get along with you and don't want to be bothered by other things, you'll probably be a materialist secularist. So I think between the spread of the instinctual positions into which the gene pool puts us all, the healthiest position is to have spiritual systems which cater for as many different needs as possible. And that's kind of where we're heading. But actually living together is harder than it sounds.
Certainly is.
It is indeed.
I'll mention a difficulty of mine, and that is that in my haste always to get through the email, when we set this up, I never asked you about timings other than when I started. And I'm going to have to leave quite shortly because it's getting past 4 o'clock in the afternoon here on a Friday, and I need to get home to sort some things out before journeying to Wales for the evening, starting my drive in a couple of hours.
Oh,
So I'll need to wind up quite soon.
yeah.
I've got a question that could bring together whales and would be short, and something I've wanted to ask you because Michael Martin, he was mentioning his heroes, Robert Herrick and Thomas Traherne and others. A name I've probably only mentioned once here, and someday we'll do a full show on it. But with your connection with Wales and the UK, a very prophetic figure for me. Somebody who's starting to bring together this higher synthesis of pagan and Christian was John Cooper Powys, who wrote, I saw your dissertation was on, maybe 15th century Wales. He wrote a great novel, Owain Glendower, which has this beautiful opening chapter on St. John's Day as it was celebrated around the Trappist monastery. And it would make any young person, one of these anxious young people I mentioned, so longing for that. Are you familiar with his work? What do you think of him?
I think that he needs a good editor. I think he writes too much in most of his books. I think in some of them, like a Glastonbury romance, it works. The number of characters and the pace of the book sustains the length. But in others, it just rambles too much. There are too many characters, too many things happening at once, and it all goes on a bit too long. I do like his poetry. I mean, that is concise, concentrated, and very good. So my answer to your question is it depends on which bits of Powys.
Yeah, absolutely. I've tended to do mostly the nonfiction, his book on Rabelais and a book on Dostoevsky. For some reason, that's where I don't think they're his best. So accessible and so much is in there, his gems, especially a chapter in his book on Rabelais, on the religion of Rabelais, which might be the most prophetic distillation and condensation of what a lot of us are talking about now, at least for me. So thanks for that, Professor Hutton.
And I have just one little question. What's on your festival schedule for right now?
Well, I've just been through a big one, and that is the kind of beginning of autumn, beginning of harvest celebrations here in the UK, the feasts that used to be called Lammas or Lunasar or Gwyl Awst, which is the main summer camp season here in the UK. It's when the ground is driest and the weather is most reliably warm. And so I've just been through a tour of different summer camps. I was invited to speak at each, enabled me to share in the camp's activities and re-meet a lot of people. So I did 4 of them in a couple of weeks. So I've been on the road a lot. And so it's time now for me to step back a bit from major festivities and go in for local festivities, like harvest homes. We do good harvest festivals here in the west of England, with villages having dances, with often rural bands with good folk music. I mean, this is the same across your nation as well. Harvest homes in Idaho with country music are just as good or even infinitely superior to anything that we can do here in Somerset.
Yeah, we'll be doing the same thing. We started planning Michaelmas today at breakfast. So thhank you so much, Ronald, for talking to us. It's been a great pleasure after
Very
all
grateful.
these years of knowing your work and studying your work to finally have a chance to speak to you.
It's been delightful speaking to both of you. To have such compassionate, courteous, erudite companions for just over an hour on a Friday afternoon is delightful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We'll see you again sometime.
I look forward to it.
Keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We will see you next week.